Gouache? Very interesting name. Whether you've never heard of gouache before or you've been curious but scared about using gouache in your coloring books, today I will share a few tips on how to use it so you can relax and have fun with your self care. Hi, I'm Regina, and this is the second video in this series of using water medium in your coloring books. I'll link the first video about watercolors up here. Today, I want to share a few tips on how to use gouache in your coloring books. What is gouache? Gouache is simply an opaque watercolor. It uses gum arabic, the same binder as watercolor, but has larger pigments because it's not as finely grounded as watercolor. It also has chalk added to make it flat and opaque. All right, as you can see on my fancy illustrations here, very high tech. um, the watercolor, the pigments of watercolor is very finely ground, and the pigments will seep on underneath the paper. So if you think of this line as the paper, that pigments will go underneath. With gouache, because the pigments are bigger than watercolor, it will sit on top of the paper. And if you're wondering what this middle one is, well, stay tuned because the next video we're gonna take a look at this um, I would say the third type of watercolor, which I think would be the perfect watercolor for coloring books. There are two different types of gouache. First is the traditional gouache that is water soluble, and second is an acrylic gouache that is not water soluble. If you see the word acrylic or acryla gouache on the tube, that is the acrylic gouache. But in this video, we're going to focus on the traditional gouache that is water soluble. All right, first, let's take a look at the supplies that you'll be using. First, obviously, you're going to need some gouache paints. Which one to get is based on your budget and preference. If you cut the page out of your coloring books to be framed and displayed, then you need to be concerned with the light fastness of your paints, which means you need to get artist grade gouache paints with good light fastness. If you don't cut out your page and leave them in the coloring books, then you don't need to worry about light fastness and you have more options regarding paints. You can use fugitive colors if you want to, and more student grade paints that are easier on the budget. If this is your first time using gouache, I suggest start with a basic set of primary colors plus white gouache, and sometimes there's also black gouache in there. But you don't have to have the black gouache, but you definitely need the white gouache. You will learn more about color mixing by starting with a small set. If you feel uncomfortable mixing colors, you can get the this Arteza 60 gouache colors, or you can get, I believe they also have the 24 color one, but this 60 set also has metallic colors. So if you use metallic in your coloring books, then maybe this is a better set to get. And so these are all the colors for the 60 set. When I first started with gouache, I was so overwhelmed with all the colors from the Artisa set, the 60 color set that I got, that I basically just grabbed this basic set from Royal Talents. Um, this one has more, I guess, more expanded primary colors because it has the cool yellow, warm red, cool blue, warm blue, white, and a black. Um, this set is pretty good to start with, but I noticed lately that the binder got separated from, from the pigment. So I don't know if I've just got a bad batch, but I also have this Winsor Newton gouache that I actually got this from Michael's. I, had a coupon and I saw this. I never seen it anywhere else. I couldn't find it. I didn't see it on Blick either. So I don't know. I think I have a feeling this is probably um, like a student grade gouache. I found it on uh, Amazon a couple months ago also, but the price was so much more expensive than when I got it from Michael's, which is a surprise. But I really enjoy this set. This set comes with 10 colors, and it has white, primary yellow, medium yellow, vermilion, primary red, ultramarine, primary blue, medium green, burnt sienna, and black. And the colors are very nice, creamy, no binder separation. And I've been enjoying using this gouache. There's also another type of gouache that you've probably seen, and I talked about this in my last haul video. If you want to check that video, I'll link it up here. This is the jelly gouache. I haven't opened this one because I have the big set already. But this is also another option if you want to see what type of gouache to use, because this is pretty budget friendly, and it comes in this 30 milliliters cup, like a pudding cup. If you have no preference and you just want to try it out, I would definitely start with like either the small set, like this Winsor Newton gouache, or the Royal Talons. Um, I would definitely start with like a smaller set like this. This is a nice set to start with because it has both the warm and cool primaries. If you want more artist grade gouache, I would recommend starting with either Daniel Smith, that has the basics starter set, the primary colors with white. I don't have Daniel Smith, but I do have I have these Turner design gouache. You can, uh, I don't think they might have the primary set. I have a bigger set, but you can start just with getting a red, yellow, and blue and white to start with. Or you can also, I also have Holbein gouache. You can start with um, same thing with yellow, blue, and red, and a tube of white to start with. I believe Holbein also has the maybe a bigger tube. It was on Amazon. I don't know. I don't think it's available right now, but it was this the four tubes was about $25 for, I think, a bigger tube than this. This is a 5 milliliter. I believe that was 15 milliliters of each of these colors. So you can start there if you need the artist grade um, paints. Here's the next tip. With gouache, you also need to swatch your paints. So these are the swatch that I made for this set. And I this is just a regular watercolor. Yeah, this is a watercolor paper. And for each color, I put a stripe of, if you see in the back there, there's a stripe of black with Sharpie. Those are just like Sharpie, so I can see how opaque the color is. These are pretty much the paint straight from the tube. All I did was just put a little dollop of paint and I spread it with the brush. Because some colors, some pigments are transparent, and some pigments are not more opaque. So you can see which, when you swatch, when you create a swatch for your paints, you can see the actual color of the paints. And so, because sometimes the color on the tube is not really a good representation of the actual paint, so it's much better if you can swatch your paints. And as I mentioned earlier, the 60 set comes with these 12 metallic colors, or these two, the last two rows are the metallic colors. If you are considering getting this one, if you don't want to mix your own colors. So, all right, next tip, get a bigger tube of white gouache. The white gouache, it's your new best friend. With watercolor, you lighten value with water. With gouache, you lighten value with the white paint. Now, there are two types of white gouache. The titanium white, which some brands also call permanent white, is the most common white gouache. When people talk about white gouache, it's usually the titanium white. And the titanium white gives you more opaque and bright colors when you mix it with different hue. You'll also see the zinc white. The zinc white is not as opaque, and it usually gives it slightly muted color. Next tip is the brush. For gouache, I prefer not to use brushes that are more suitable for watercolor, like uh, brushes with natural or a mix of synthetic and natural hair, like natural sable or natural squirrel, or a mix of natural and synthetic of sable or squirrel. I explained a little bit more about the brushes in the watercolor video if you want to check them out. For gouache, I prefer to use the mixed media brushes like the Princeton Velvet Touch or Princeton Select brushes. Also, Royal Langnickel, the Zen line from Royal and Langnickel. I also have this brush from Sarah Burns and Craftimo collaboration. She is, I think, primarily a gouache artist, so I wanted to try her brush, and this is one of the brushes that came in the box. So most people, I think, have the round brushes, the round shape, and I think it's the most versatile brushes. But for gouache, I would also add flat brushes and some angled flat brushes also. The reason you need to get flat brushes is because gouache has larger pigments, and flat brushes are easier to use to push the paint around compared to round brushes. Now, you need to keep the round brushes to paint, you know, more detailed work. But the flat brushes are good to cover a large area, or more like a flat, if you need to do some flat wash on quite big area. The brush that I definitely do not recommend is the craft brush. This is the one I got from Shuttle Art gel crayon set. This is very stiff and hard, and this will ruin your paper. So do not use the craft brush. And I also would not recommend using water brush, because water brush will continuously feed water out. With gouache, you want to limit the amount of water that mix into the paint. So do not use water brush. Next tip is the paper. So definitely get books with thicker paper if possible. But because gouache has larger pigments, the paint doesn't actually seep into the paper. it's gonna sit on top of the paper. So you can use books with slightly thinner paper. All right, with the type of paper to use with gouache, we were using this Rooms of Wonder book for when we were um, testing the watercolor on coloring book. And this book has pretty nice thick paper. And yes, if you can get thick paper, definitely get them. But with gouache, because the paint is sits on top of the paper, is not going to soak in. You can actually get away with books with thinner paper. So I'm just getting this as an example. This is Splendid Cities. It's an old book I have. If you can you can tell the paper is thinner, right, than the Rooms of Wonder. And I this is a whip I was working on, and this is gouache that I put on here, and there's no um, bleed through whatsoever. So you can tell with gouache, you don't need to worry too much if you don't have a very thick paper. So thicker paper if you can, but this is why I like gouache, because you can actually use it for books that doesn't have as thick paper as we'd like. And that's why gouache is perfect for coloring books. Next tip, the kinds of illustrations that are perfect for coloring with gouache. I suggest start with illustrations that have bigger spaces, not too many details. Folk arts, buildings, like graphics. All right, so with the kind of illustrations um, to start with gouache, I would highly suggest to start with um, illustrations that are that have big spaces, open spaces like this. That's not too small, too detailed. Because if you have illustrations that's finely drawn like that, it's gonna be hard to do with gouache. So I highly recommend anything that has big open spaces like this. This is another book that I mentioned. I mentioned folk arts and buildings and graphics. So this is a book that I recently got in my recent haul. So folk art has usually the illustrations would have this nice open spaces like this. So this would be perfect for gouache. Even on the leaves, even though it's small, it's not that detailed. You can actually paint these with gouache. So this would be um, perfect to practice with gouache if you want to. Good illustrations to start with gouache. Next tip, it's even more important to have scrap paper nearby. Always test the color that you mixed on your scrap paper and wait until it's dry. With gouache, the light color will dry darker and the dark color will dry lighter. So you need to check the colors before you put it on your coloring pages. Next tip, 2 jars of water, just like watercolor, one for dirty water and one for clean water. The I put paint puck in my dirty water so I can clean my brush off it. Next tip is to have a plate or a palette. You can use ceramic palette if you like, or plastic palette. If you have a plate, ceramic plate that you don't use anymore for eating, then you can use that too. Just do not use it for food anymore. Reserve it just for your paint only, even if it's clean. Next step, to have paper towel or sponge or a rag to uh, dry your brush, to wipe excess paint from your brush, especially useful when you try to do dry brushing, which is another tip I will discuss more later. I would say paper towel probably is ideal for um, gouache because most of the time you're going to wipe off the actual paint, not to absorb the excess water. Um, but if you prefer to use a rag or a sponge, you can do that too. All right, before we get to the next tip, I want to give a shout out to Skillshare. No, this video is not sponsored, but I've been using Skillshare for a few years now, and I love how I can learn a lot of things from watercolor to gouache to learning how to do videos to help grow this channel. So I love Skillshare. I learned so much from being a member. If you want to join Skillshare, I have a link below in the description box, and you can get 1 month free and 40% off your first payment. All right, now let's talk about the painting tips. Next tip is to use fresh paints from the tube. With watercolor, you definitely should put paints in a palette and then let them dry because that is more economical to use watercolor that way than using it straight from the tubes. But with gouache, it's better to use them fresh. Can you use dried gouache? Yes, absolutely, because it is water soluble. But I found that the colors is not as rich, and depending on the brands, sometimes the paints get gummy and doesn't dissolve as well. So I highly recommend using fresh paints from the tubes. Next step, add water a little bit at a time. All you have to do is just wet your brush. So I have my clean water here. You're just gonna dip your brush into the jar, and that's how much water you need to add to your gouache. So add a little bit at a time. You don't need to add too much. If you're familiar with watercolor, you might be adding too much water at first. So this is a tip for you. Do not add too much water. Add a little bit at a time. You can always add more water. Next tip, just like watercolor, with gouache, you also want to use the tea to butter consistencies. So with gouache, butter is pretty much straight, just 100% paint. So if we're using this paint right here with no water added, so that will be butter. You can see there's a dry brushing um, texture there because we don't have that much water. So that will be your butter. So if we add a little bit of water to the paint, so I'm gonna add, pull this a little bit, separate it here, and just dip your brush into the water. You're gonna get this cream consistency. You get a smoother um, application on the paper. Okay, so if we adding another, um, all I did was just dip my brush into the water, and that's it. That's how much water you're going to add, a little bit at a time. You're just going to add it to this mix right here. And this will become a little, so it's going to be a little watery, and it's going to become your milk consistency. You see that, right? You can see the brush strokes. This is a little bit thinner. Okay, so if I dip my brush again into the water and adding it to this mixture we have here, this is going to become your coffee consistency. I don't know if it's showing on the camera, but I can see that the brush strokes a little more because it's a lot thinner than the milk. Okay, so now the lightest consistency is the tea. I'm gonna dip my brush into the water and add it to this mixture here. And this is gonna be your very watery. You can see the brush strokes even more with the tea consistency. Okay, so now you know the five consistencies that we're going to use for gouache. So most of the time with gouache, you're probably only going to use the coffee, milk, cream, and butter consistency for the very top layer. And that's when you usually get your dry brushing texture on the very top. Next step, to mix more color than you think you need. It's very hard to try to match the color that you mix if you run out of it. So mix more color than you think you need. Next tip, don't add the white paint to the color, add the color to the white paint. Okay, so when you're adding white to the color, or I'm trying to lighten the value, I'm going to add some white paint here. So what you want to do is not adding white to the color, but add color to the white. So let's we just wet my brush a little bit. Let's just grab a little bit of white here and just grab a little bit of color from here and mix it to the white. Do you see how that's already adding so much color to this white paint, right? Even if you want it lighter, you're gonna add more white to this mixture. So this is what you want to do. What you don't want to do is adding white to the color. It's gonna take forever to lighten the value. So what I'm talking about, so let's say if we separate this a little bit, right? Let's say you want to lighten that paint right there, and you're just gonna grab a little bit of white into here. It doesn't lighten it that much at all. if at all. This is what you don't want to do. Because if you want to lighten the value, you're going to add so much more white to it than if you just add a little bit of color into the white. Do you see the difference? Right? Okay. Next tip is the order to apply the values. With gouache, I prefer to add mid value first, and then dark value, and then light value. Unlike watercolor, gouache is an opaque medium. So you can actually go light to dark or dark to light. You don't need to worry about preserving the light because you can actually paint over it. But if this is your first time using gouache, I would highly recommend just start with a flat wash. Don't worry about the dark value or the light value. And this is especially good, especially if you're using gouache for folk art illustrations, which is perfect if you just use flat wash. If we look at this mixture right here, I already mixed from what we just did. So I already mixed this paint right here. I would say probably this is um, good mid value, but you definitely need to test your color because gouache paints, the light color dries darker. So you want to make sure that's the color you would like to have. So that's your, I would say that's the mid value. And then I'm going to test the dark value. Let's see. No, that's too watery. Okay, let's say that's the dark value. So I don't know if you can tell the difference between the mid value when we first just added it to where it is now. It looks darker than when we just put it on the paper. So that is something that we need to do with gouache because of the change in values when they dry. Since the mid value is going to be the first layer we put on the paper, you want it to be the most watery um, mixture. So we are just probably going to make this into like a coffee consistency, so that when we put more paint on top, it's going to be, we can make it creamier. We can add more paint to it. More water. Yeah, I can see a little bit of um, streak, the brush strokes, because it's pretty thin. Okay, so I'm going to add the mid value first to this section right here. And because gouache is an opaque medium, I know that some people like to hide the black lines, white it out with paint pen or anything like that. With gouache, do you see that? You can just immediately cover that line. You don't even need paint pen. If you make a mess, that's okay because you can cover it up later with um, more paint. Okay, so that's your mid value. Next step, with gouache, you definitely have to do one layer at a time. Put one layer down, wait until it's dry, and then put your next layer. If you work on wet paint, it might mix the color together and create mud. So you don't want to do that. Because gouache paint has larger pigments, it only sits on the top of the paper and it's easier to lift than watercolor. So when you try to layer, it will activate that bottom layer easier than with watercolor. Next tip, fat over lean. No, do not cancel me. This is a term from oil painting. This means you want to paint with the watery mixture first as your base layer and put the creamier mixture on top. Using the tea to butter consistency, your very top layer, which is usually the lightest value, is going to have the thickest consistency. Next tip, when layering paint, be aware of your brush strokes. You don't want to move your brush back and forth. You want to be more economical with your brush strokes. Okay, so when I um, said when be aware of your brush strokes, you don't want to move your brush back and forth um, when you are putting on the second layer and another layer on top of that. So, for example, I put in this base layer right here. And if I want to put, um, let's say, just a white uh, highlight on top or anything like that, or any kind of drawing or something like that. Let's say I want to put a circle on top of this. If I do it in a very rigorous way, it's going to um, agitate that paint on the bottom. Because the gouache pigments are larger than watercolor, it sits on top of the paper, so it's easier to lift. So if you, let's say you want to do a stripe, let's do a stripe. If you're gonna do a stripe of white on top of this paint, and you do it this way, it's going to agitate that color. If you do it, do you see how it now it turns to orange, right? So when you are layering colors, layering the gouache paint, just make sure you're using your brush strokes in a very intentional, very economical, just as efficient as you can. Um, so if I'm gonna add like a white stripe to this, then I'm just going to do one or two brush strokes and leave it at that and leave it to dry. And then if you want to add more, then add more. But don't try to move the brush, multiple times, because you're going to agitate that color underneath. All right, before we get to the last tip, if you like this video so far, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. Easy peasy. And please subscribe. Is that button right there? It helps the channel and it's free. And turn on the notification bell so you'll know when the next video is up. Also, comment below on one thing you learned from this video and let me know if you have any questions. All right, the last tip, dry brushing. It is the perfect gouache technique to use on coloring books because practically you have no water on your brush. So good for paper on coloring books. For dry brushing, it is the perfect gouache technique to use on coloring books because you don't need that much water on your brush. You pretty much have no water on your brush or very, very little. So what you want to do with dry brushing. So let's paint another layer here. Okay, with dry brushing, so what you're going to do is grab uh, paint straight from the tube with no water mixed um, on it, and you're going to wipe the excess paint on your paper towel, and that's going to be your dry brushing on the paint on that first layer. And it's a really good technique for coloring book because you have pretty much no water, and because it's thicker consistency than the paint underneath, it's not going to agitate that layer underneath as much. So it's a very good technique, just to add the lightest value on your um, coloring, if you want to, add different values. But yeah, so I highly recommend using dry brushing for your coloring. In the next video of this series, we're going to explore the most perfect watercolor for coloring books. Have fun with your self care.